This speech was originally given on June 13th. It was at a Congregation Ahavat Torah at Shalashudas. My sister and I sponsored in memory of our father's 12th yahrzeit. He was niftar on 30th day of Sivan, first day Rosh Chodesh 2014. Sidney Rosenberg, Tzadok ben Moshe HaKohen. It was also the day later in the evening when the Knicks won their first championship in 53 years, so it was a red letter day. Some of us are old enough to remember the presidential election of 1964. Senator Barry Goldwater running against incumbent Lyndon Johnson. And I was a grade schooler, and I remember very clearly walking to school the next morning, Wednesday, November 4th, relieved that Johnson had won because listening to the adults, it sounded like Goldwater was kind of scary. What I did not realize was how grateful I should be for the things Johnson had done and was going to do as a supporter of the Jewish people and of the state of Israel. I was a kid, I didn't know, and some things had not taken place yet. Before I even get to the main topic, I'm going to speak about LBJ because it is right. And hold on to those 4 words, because it is right. They're going to come back. He was born in 1908. There's been speculation that he was Jewish on his mother's side. That's never been confirmed. It was his father's side that was extremely sympathetic to Jews. His grandfather on his father's side belonged to a church that regarded the Jewish people as special and needed to be taken care of. This manifested itself in several ways. His aunt, Johnson's aunt, was a member of the Zionist Organization of America. Also, his father and his grandfather demonstrated at risk to their lives in favor of the exoneration of Leo Frank. Now, who is Leo Frank? He was a Jew born in Texas, raised in New York, went down to Georgia to manage a pencil factory. A young girl was murdered at the factory and he was accused, falsely, as it definitely turned out. The story generated as much attention in this country as the O.J. Simpson trial 80 years later. And the Johnsons demonstrated in favor of exoneration at risk to their lives because the Ku Klux Klan threatened them because they wanted to convict the Jew. Eventually, Frank was convicted and sentenced to die. The governor of Georgia commuted the sentence to life in prison. He had to leave the state because his life was in danger. Eventually, people broke into the prison and kidnapped Frank, and he was lynched. The only Jew on record in America I'm aware of who was ever lynched. As an aside, there was an excellent TV movie made about that story in 1988 by NBC. It starred Jack Lemmon as the governor and James Mason as the anti-Semitic prosecutor. Mason had a lot of range. He not only played that, but 6 years earlier, he had played the Jew Isaac of York in Ivanhoe, so he had a lot of range. But he's eclipsed by Lord Laurence Olivier. In 1976, Olivier plays a Nazi against Dustin Hoffman in Marathon Man. And then 3 times in 5 years, he plays an old Jewish man. He seemed to love doing it. He did it in 1978, playing a Simon Wiesenthal type character in The Boys of Brazil against Gregory Peck, who plays Yosef Mengele. Then he did it again in 1980 as in The Jazz Singer remake with Neil Diamond. And there's a moment in there where he reaches up for the mezuzah at his son's house and it's not there and his whole body trembles. Only we would notice something like that. People would not understand he was trembling because there was no mezuzah. It's like in the scene in The Frisco Kid where Gene Wilder is with Penny Pizer at the entrance to her father's home. He's president of the shul. If you look closely, the mezuzah is tilted in the wrong direction, but only we would notice that. The third time that Olivier plays an old Jew is in a TV movie by HBO called Mr. Halpern and Mr. Johnson, opposite Jackie Gleason. And this is in 1983. And in TV Guide, I read that Gleason had to teach Olivier how to pronounce Rosh Hashanah. And I get to insert my father into the Dvar Torah because he met Jackie Gleason once. He and my uncle started a moving company in the mid-50s, and they schlepped themselves at the beginning. My father used to carry literally refrigerators on his back. So he's in an elevator with Jackie Gleason wearing his moving uniform. Company is relatively young. And he's talking to Jackie, explaining about the company. And when they get off the elevator, he says to Gleason, "Jackie, you think I'll make it?" And Jackie says, "Don't worry, you'll make it, kid." Gleason was right. The company lasted 54 years. So that was a story that my father told. And I want to say that my father, when he told a story, you could take it to the bank. Sometimes I did not get confirmation for 50 years, but I'm going to give you a little history lesson for those unaware of this. My father was brought up in a shtetl called Ulanov, which back in those days, before World War II, was smack in the middle of Poland. Now it's in the southeastern corner because the borders changed after the war. Hitler and Stalin had agreed to carve up Poland. Ulanov was right in the middle. And fortunately, the Russians cheated. And a Jewish Russian lieutenant came into town and said to my grandfather, "Get the men out of here because the Nazis are going to kill them." So the three sons and the father went with the Russians, and very, very long story, very short. Eventually, the whole family wound up in the Soviet Union. And my father's oldest brother, who eventually became the Candyman of B'nai Yeshurun in Teaneck for 30 years, who was 19 at the time, said to his father, my grandfather, "Give back the Soviet citizenship. Keep the Polish citizenship." My grandfather says, "Why?" He says, "God told me so." Okay? So he does that, and they're immediately sent to the Gulag, to the labor camps, which really upset my grandfather, but my grandmother said, "Let it go, God has a reason." In 1941, June, Hitler attacks Stalin. And this is what my father told me, and I couldn't find it in any history book. He said that FDR told Stalin that he would only provide him with equipment if he let the non-citizens out of the camps. And that's how they got out, because they had Polish citizenship. I didn't get confirmation for this, unfortunately, till after my father had passed. 2015, a friend of mine named Alex lent me a book called White Nights. It's a book by Menachem Begin. It's called White Nights because he was also in the Gulag north of the Arctic Circle, where you have daylight 24 hours. Menachem Begin was a political prisoner in the Gulag, less than a snowball's chance in hell of getting out. How did he get out? Polish citizenship, and the rest is history. So we'll now get back to Lyndon Johnson. He was born in 1908, and he became a congressman in 1937 at the age of 29. And he was way ahead of the curve, knowing that the Nazis represented a danger to the Jews. The first book he bought his future wife after their first date was a book on the danger of Nazism. He legislated to try to get Jews into this country legally. Of course, FDR's administrations blocked that. But he did two things that are under the radar. There's no paper trail, but the personal recollections of people confirm this firmly. The first one was called Operation Texas. About 450 Jews had gotten into Mexico, South America, and Cuba. And apparently, if they didn't get into the US, they were going to have to go back to Europe. So Johnson got them into America illegally through Galveston. There's no paper trail. A fellow named Lou Gumelek in 1989 tried to write a doctoral thesis on this subject, but there just wasn't enough paperwork to support it. However, a fellow named Jim Novy, who was at the center of Operation Texas, testified to this. 5 weeks after Johnson became president, on December 30th, 1963, Johnson and his wife showed up at conservative synagogue Congregation Ahavat Torah in Austin, Texas, as guests. Jim Novy, a friend of Johnson going back to 1938, 25 years earlier, told everyone about Operation Texas. Johnson said nothing about it, but after the ceremony, after the event was over, one person after another came up to Lady Bird Johnson and said that without her husband, they would have never gotten out of Europe alive. So that was one thing under the radar. The second thing was Johnson had gone to Dachau after the war, saw what happened. He came home, and again, this is based on personal recollections of people, no paper trail. He had small arms sent to Jewish freedom fighters in Palestine in crates marked Texas grapefruits. So those are some of the things he did that are not on the record. Now we go to what's on the record. Johnson became a senator in 1949, after 12 years in the House. After only one term, 6 years, in 1955, he became Senate Majority Leader, which is astonishing, just in time. Why? Because the next year, in 1956, was the Sinai Campaign. Israel, working with France and England, Great Britain, had captured the Sinai Desert. And Eisenhower forced Israel to give it back. Now, you might cut Eisenhower some slack saying maybe he wanted to make sure that the United States had influence there instead of Britain and France, but it was way beyond that. He tried to impose economic sanctions to punish Israel unilaterally. Johnson, as Senate Majority Leader, basically told Eisenhower to shove it, and the sanctions never passed. Now we go to Johnson's presidency. He was the first U.S. president to provide Israel with offensive weapons just in time, because France had stopped providing the pipeline. Then came the Six-Day War. And we have to talk about Arthur Goldberg. Who was Arthur Goldberg? He was the 94th Supreme Court Justice, the fourth out of 8 Jewish Supreme Court Justices. The first 3 were Louis Brandeis, number 67, Benjamin Cardozo, number 75, after who YU's law school is named, Felix Frankfurter, number 78, then there's a gap. Then you have Goldberg, then right after him is Abe Fortas, nominated by Johnson, then you have 2 by President Clinton and 1 by President Obama, so there are 8. Arthur Goldberg was Supreme Court Justice. And just to give you a little history, Brandeis was nominated by Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson was a vicious, anti-black, prejudiced president, but somehow he liked Jews, and he brought in the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice. But the person he nominated before Brandeis was James Clark McReynolds, who was such an anti-Semite that he walked out of the room every time Brandeis would speak, and he did the same thing to Cardozo. That was number 66. Justice number 69, on the other hand, who was nominated by Warren Gamliel Harding, was William Howard Taft, who was incredibly pro-Jewish and pro-Jewish religion on the religious side. So you had a lot of back and forth going on in the Supreme Court in the 1910s and 1920s. Just a side note, back to Arthur Goldberg. In 1965, Adlai Stevenson died. Who was Adlai Stevenson? He had run against Eisenhower in 56 and in 52 for the presidency. He's the last person to have lost 2 presidential races in this country. He was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and he died. Johnson convinced Goldberg to leave the Supreme Court and become U.S. ambassador to the UN, and he replaced him with Abe Fortas. Then came the Six-Day War 2 years later. Arthur Goldberg wrote a letter to the New York Times in 1980 stating that when the UN came out with Resolution 242, which was the definitive UN resolution on the Six-Day War, Johnson, through Goldberg, made absolutely sure there was no mention of Jerusalem. You can rest assured every Arab country and so many others wanted it mentioned in there so that Israel would have to give back the old city or internationalize it. Johnson said, no way, not happening. That was Lyndon Johnson. 2 weeks after the Six-Day War, Johnson met in Glassboro, New Jersey, not far from here, with Alexei Kosygin. Alexei Kosygin was the premier of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1980. He met with Johnson in Glassboro and asked him a very simple question. There are 80 million Arabs in the Middle East, only 3 million Jews. Why do you side with Israel? And Johnson said, because it is right. So that goes back to those 4 words I mentioned earlier. In the pantheon of presidents that we view as supporters of Judaism or Jews and Israel, I think Johnson tends to get overlooked. And so I felt compelled to mention this without even getting into the main subject. The main subject, which we'll get to in a moment, was generated by a remark by Senator Goldwater, but I remember the 64 election in Johnson. I thought it was a good time to bring him up. Now we come to the main topic. Senator Goldwater, among many things, said, quote unquote, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. The religion of his paternal grandfather, Mr. Goldwasser, yes, our religion, Judaism, would strongly disagree. Judaism abhors extremism, and we're going to go through a whole bunch of sources in Tanakh, in Talmud, and elsewhere to support that contention. We'll go chronologically. We'll start with Parshas Vayechi. Yaakov is telling his sons what's in store for them. And of course, Shimon and Levi had wiped out the whole city, all the men in Shechem, in response to what happened to their sister Dinah. Definitely extreme. You wipe out a whole city for something like that. And Yaakov basically says, I'm excommunicating them. Which in Judaism doesn't mean what it means in other religions. It means I don't want to communicate with them. And then he hits them where it hurts, in the real estate. That's where it hurts. Shimon wound up with, he said, Afitzeim achalchem b'Yaakov, Afitzeim b'Yisrael. Basically, Shimon just had a scattering of cities among Judah. They didn't have a Nachla. Levi, because they redeemed themselves somewhat by coming to Moshe's aid during the Cheder Egel, got 48 cities, 6 Ari Miklat, and 42 other cities. There were 3 different measurements of how big those cities were. The smallest one is Ramban, next is Rashi, and the largest one is Rambam. Obviously, I favor the largest one being a Kohen. But even if you take Rambam's measurement and multiply it by the 48 cities, it's still not remotely close to the average size of a Nachla. So they were penalized for their extremism in Shechem. Next, we go to Moshe Rabbeinu at the burning bush. What qualified Moshe to be the leader, to be the ultimate prophet? Anivus, humility. What does humility mean? Dr. Charles Poppers, a member of our community, explained it to me years ago. He said, Anivus means understanding that everything comes from Hashem. You have 2 guys, both wealthy. The first one says, look how wealthy I am, look how accomplished I am, look how smart I am. The second one says, doesn't matter how smart I am, doesn't matter how accomplished I am, without Hashem, I wouldn't have a penny. That's anivus, that's humility. And we will find that extremists invariably wind up violating the very principles that they originally espouse. So Moshe's at the burning bush, and he doesn't want the job to lead the people out of Egypt. So what does he say? I have a speech impediment. Now he should know better, because speech comes from Hashem, and Hashem says so exactly that way. He says, Mi sam pe la'adam. Who gave man the power of speech? It doesn't say yet that Hashem is angry, but you can tell by the language he's on the borderline. Then Moshe goes over the line. If you recall the TV show All in the Family, Archie Bunker's most dismissive remark was, whatever. Moshe basically says to Hashem, Shlach bi'atishlach, whomever. Then you see Vayichar Hashem, God gets angry, and he refers to Aharon Levi, and all the commentaries agree that's when Moshe loses the kahuna. You could say, well, maybe Moshe didn't mind losing the kahuna. Oh, he minded all right. If you go to Parshas Sav, we have the last of the 4 shalshelis in the Torah, it's Trup. Shalshelis is the longest note. It always denotes delay. The first 8 days in the Mishkan, Moshe was in charge of the Avodah. Then he had to hand it over to Aharon. And that last Vayishchat has a Shalshelis. He did not want to hand it over. He really felt terrible losing the kahuna. So he was punished for his extremism, for extremely trying to avoid being the leader of the Jewish people. And the irony is he wound up getting the job anyway. Next we go to Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest man. He has 3 books in Tanakh, Shir Shirim, Mishlei, and Koheles. Since wisdom is supposed to come with age, the one he wrote last, Koheles, when he was oldest, would be the ultimate book of wisdom in Tanakh. In Perek Zayin, Pasuk Tes Zayin, he writes, Al tiyeh tzadik harbeh, don't be too righteous. And then in the next sentence he says, why should you destroy yourself? He's saying that extremism, even in the pursuit of being righteous, is self-destructive. So far, so good. We move forward to Eliyahu Hanavi in Perek Yutes in Melachim Aleph. He's just finished the episode at Mount Carmel where he managed to get a sacrifice burned even though it was soaking wet, and 400 prophets of Baal have been killed. Eliyahu is on the run for his life. King Achav and his wife Izebel want to kill him. So he's hiding in a cave. And Hashem asks him basically for a status update. And he uses extreme language. He says, Kano kinesi. I am very jealous for God. I am a zealot. And a zealot is an extremist. So Hashem gives him a couple of examples of extremism. He gives him a huge wind, which is strong enough to break rocks, an earthquake, and a fire. But Hashem doesn't communicate that way. He comes to him in a small voice and gives him another chance, another status update. And again, he says, Kano kinesi. At that point, Hashem basically says, go back to the dugout, we're getting a relief pitcher. And he gives him 3 tasks. He tells him to anoint Chazael, king of Aram, which is unusual to anoint a foreign king, to anoint Yehu ben Nimshi for Shomron, and to get Elisha to take his place. If you look at the order, though, Hashem reverses it. He's in such a hurry to get rid of this extremist. He puts Elisha in place first and lets Elisha take care of the anointments. And so Eliyahu's tenure is cut short as a result of his extremist expressions. Next, we go to my favorite king in the history of the Israeli nation. Israel had 41 kings. 3 when the country was united, Shaul, David, and Shlomo. Yes, the first 6.5 years of David's reign, the kingdom was split, but then it reunified. Then you have the kingdom split between Yehuda and Shomron. Each side had 19 kings, but with a big difference. All of the 19 kings in Yehuda were from the Davidic line, father to son, with a few exceptions at the end. Some goes in the other direction, an uncle now and then. On the other side, you had 9 different dynasties for these 19 kings. So there were a lot of assassinations and coups, and they didn't last as long. They lasted 133 years earlier. The 10 lost tribes, as we refer to them, were exiled 133 years before the Churban Bayis Rishon. Now, that took place in 554 because Churban Bayis Rishon was in 421 BCE. Many people go with the date 586 BCE. This is wrong. I gave a speech about this back in 2006 based on an article in Jewish Action, which rips apart the 586. And also my presentation was based on the number of years in our calendar, the introduction to the Mishnah Torah by the Rambam, where he lists all the Bali Mesorah. It's based also on the Rashi in Masechet Megillah, Daf Yudalad Amud Aleph, where Rashi lists all the Nevi'im and Nevi'ot. So it's, and also the Gemara says that the Beis HaMikdash, the second one was 420 years and the first one was 410 years. So since we know the second was destroyed in the year 70, and there's no year 0, so the second Beis HaMikdash had to come online in 351. There was a 70-year exile period, so the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed in 421 BCE. That should get rid of the 586. Anyway, the 13th king of the Davidic line was King Menashe, the longest reigning 55 years. He so totally saturated Judea with Avodah Zarah that Hashem decrees that there's going to be destruction. The first Beis HaMikdash will be destroyed. It's a done deal. But it's always a good idea to check Divrei Hayamim because you find things in there that you won't find in Malachim and other places. It actually says in Divrei Hayamim that he did tshuva, that Menashe did tshuva, but it was too late. He had already done too much damage. So after he dies, his son Ammon with an Aleph takes over. He's killed, assassinated, after 2 years. So his grandson, the 15th in the Davidic line, Yoshiyahu, takes over. Yoshiyahu, my favorite, and a very tragic figure. What does he do? He ascends to the throne at the age of 8. Now it says in Parsha Shoftim in the Torah that the king has to have his own Torah. Yoshiyahu did not even know that the Torah existed. That's how bad off the country was religiously. 18 years pass. He's 26 years old. Some repair work is being done in the Beis HaMikdash, and somebody comes across a Torah scroll and brings it to him, a fellow named Chilkiah. I believe he was a Kohen Gadol. And Yoshiyahu reads the Torah scroll, and he's blown away. And he goes on a rampage to eliminate Avodah Zarah from the country. And in fact, his appearance on the scene was predicted by a Navi around the time that Yehuda and Shomron split, and he comes across the grave of that Navi. And so he does everything possible to eliminate Avodah Zarah from the country. And he holds a Pesach, which is outstanding. We read about it in the second day Yontif in the Haftorah. It says that such a Pesach had not been celebrated since the times of the Shoftim. If you look in Divrei Hayamim, it says that he celebrated a Pesach that had not been celebrated since the time of Samuel. Wait a minute, is that a stira? Is that a contradiction? Because Samuel is not considered one of the Shoftim. His book comes afterwards. And the answer is no. When counting the Shoftim, Samuel has a separate book, but he's counted as one of the Shoftim, just with a separate book. So the period of the Shoftim is 316 years, during which Pinchas is the Baal Mesorah. Then comes Eli for 39 years, and then Shmuel for 11 years. So there's no contradiction between Divrei Hayamim and Malachim Beis. Shmuel is only in charge for 11 years. He dies at the age of 50, to my way of thinking, probably from aggravation. In any case, if you do the calculation, you find that from the time that Shmuel lived, the end of the Shoftim period, until Yoshiyahu's Pesach, it's 4.5 centuries. For 4.5 centuries, nobody celebrated Pesach like Yoshiyahu. So far, so good. The guy's firing on all cylinders. But then he becomes an extremist and everything falls apart. What happens? King of Egypt is Pharaoh Necho. He wants to attack the Assyrian Empire. He has no gripe against Israel. He says, look, I don't want to touch you. I just want to attack Assyria, and I have to go through your country. There's no easy pass. There's no other way to go. This is where Yoshiyahu becomes extreme. There's a pasuk in Parshas Bechukosai. The first pasuk is in Bechukosai Telechu. 4 pasukim later, it says, Cherev lo savor be'artzachem, a sword shall not pass through your land. Now, first of all, a sword shall not pass through your land could certainly mean only if it's attacking Israel. It doesn't have to mean any kind of sword. On top of that, in Bechukosai Telechu would mean you've gone according to all of my commandments. What Yoshiyahu did not realize was that as much as he tried, he did not completely eliminate Avodah Zarah from the country. People were hiding it two-dimensionally behind their doors where the inspectors couldn't see it. He is told, Yoshiyahu is told by Yirmiyah, who is his contemporary, Yirmiyah Hanavi, let it go. But he doesn't listen. Just like I said before, a person who's an extremist winds up violating the principles he espoused. Here is Yoshiyahu not listening to a Navi from the very religion that he's supposed to be supporting. So what happens? He goes to war against Paro Necho, and he's killed and dies at Megiddo. Some of the information that I'm talking about will not be found in Tanakh. You must look on Tisha B'Av. According to Sefaria, there are 46 kinos on Tisha B'Av. We say 5 in the evening, and then 41 the next day. Number 6 in the morning, which is number 11 overall, is the kina that Yirmiyah wrote to lament the loss of Yoshiyahu. Most people don't say all the kinos, but never skip that one. Always read that one, number 6 in the morning. And in that kina, you have all this information that may be missing from Tanakh that I'm giving you. And one of the things it says in that kina is that Yoshiyahu was hit by 300 arrows. Now, I'm an accountant by profession. I take numbers very seriously. I don't know if Yirmiyahu was being accurate or being dramatic, but in any case, Yoshiyahu dies at the young age of 39 because he adopted an extremist approach. Once again, we see how extremism comes back to bite you, big time. Now we fast forward to the Second Temple period. There's an event that's recorded in Masechet Yoma, Daf Chaf Gimel. Back then, the big mitzvah was Trumas Hadeshin for the Kohanim. Eventually, they got smart and put together a lottery system. Prior to that, the Kohanim would actually race to see who could do Trumas Hadeshin. One Kohen is so extreme in his desire to do the mitzvah, he stabs another Kohen to death. I think that speaks for itself. We fast forward a little more, and we get to Churban Bayis Sheni. And you can look this up on Wikipedia, which obviously takes it from some of our sources. They were extremists, they were zealots, who wanted to force a confrontation with the Roman Empire. Before the zealots did what they did, Jerusalem had a 21-year supply of food. They could have held out a very long time. As we know from the Gemara in Gittin, in Nun Hey, Nun Vav, it was lack of food that destroyed the Jews and allowed them to fall to the Romans so quickly. The zealots who wanted to force the confrontation with Rome burned the 21 years of inventory of food. Again, extremism, zealotry, we know the result, Churban Bayis Rishon. The next to last example is in the 18th century, actually 17th and 18th century. We know that the founder of Hasidism was the Baal Shem Tov. He died in 1760. 5 years later, in 1765, Rav Simcha Bunim is born. He lived till 1827. He was a bit of a maverick, a rationalist. I kind of like him for that. And he's most famous for saying the following. He said, each person should carry 2 notes, one in each pocket. One note says, excuse me, the entire universe was created for my benefit. The other note says, I'm only dust and ashes. The idea being, if you're feeling too big for your britches, you look at the note that says, I'm only dust and ashes. If you're feeling inadequate, depressed, unfulfilled, you read, the entire universe was created for my benefit. The idea being, keep it in the middle. Don't be extreme in your emotions and your self-image. Now we get to the star of our show, the Nazir, about whom we read in Parshas Naso a few weeks ago. Some people have the wrong impression of Parshas Naso. You have to be a Balkori to appreciate it. It's 7 columns, the longest Parsha, 176 Pesukim. And people say, well, once you get to Chamishi, it's just the same 6 Pesukim repeated 12 times. They don't realize that the 4th Aliyah is 2 columns by itself, the size of half a Parsha. So you have to get through that gauntlet before you get to the easy part. That fourth aliyah has one column for the sota and one column for the nazir. In Nashim, in the Seder Nashim, they're actually reversed to the order. First comes nazir, then comes sota. So a whole column is devoted to the nazir. Who is the nazir? He is someone who takes upon himself mitzvahs that are not required. This is not lefnim mishurat hadin. Lefnim mishurat hadin means that you observe certain mitzvahs at a higher madrega more intensely than you ordinarily would. It can be gemilas chasadim, it can be tzedakah, learning, davening, lashon hara, could be all kinds of things. But you're already observing mitzvahs that you're required to keep. The nazir takes upon himself responsibilities that he doesn't have to keep. He doesn't cut his hair. He avoids anything from grapes. And he doesn't even go to the funeral of his own parents, which a Kohen can do. Rabbi Isaac Swift, who was Rabbi of Ahavat Torah from 1960 through 1984 and Rabbi Emeritus through 1991, spoke about this 50 years ago. And I remember it because every year when Parshas Naso comes up, I recall what he said. He said, the Nazir, when his tenure is over, it's always a temporary period, brings 3 korbanos. One of them is a korban chatas, a sin offering. How does he sin? He's trying to keep extra mitzvahs. Hold that thought. We'll get back to it. Hold it. I want to talk about a fellow named David Davis, not the Supreme Court Justice by that name, a fellow who was born in 1945. He was a Baptist minister in Athens, Tennessee, the buckle of the Bible Belt. If you want to understand why I call it the buckle of the Bible Belt, we'll go to an interview given by John Lennon of the Beatles in March of 1966. March 4th, 1966. An interview with John Lennon was published where he said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. That generated no controversy at all in England. But 4 months later, when across the Atlantic, in Tennessee and elsewhere, there were big Beatle burnings. In Memphis, not far, in the same state as Athens, Tennessee, there were Beatle burnings of their paraphernalia. The Klan showed up. The Ku Klux Klan showed up in their white hoods and their white outfits and their crosses. That's how extreme Tennessee was. And to this day, in 2026, Athens, Tennessee has half the population of Englewood, but 60 churches. And by the way, in that same interview, John Lennon made another remark that might have generated some controversy if it wasn't for the remark about Jesus. He said, and this is an exact quote, he said, the entertainment industry is an extension of the Jewish religion. He would have been more accurate if he said it's an extension of Jewish culture. I mean, we know that it was Jews who founded the 6 original Hollywood studios, all 3 original TV networks, etc. But what did he mean by that? What motivated him to make that remark? Everywhere he turned, he saw Jews. The Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, was Jewish. The fellow who brought them to America and put together the Shea Stadium concerts, Sid Bernstein, Jewish. The fellow who directed their first 2 movies, Hard Day's Night and Help, Richard Lester, Jewish. The DJ in America who did more to promote them than anybody else, Murray the K. Kaufman. And then there's their hairdresser. Leslie Cavendish was the hairdresser of the Beatles. He did some extraordinary work if you look at their pictures from '65. He was a Talmud Muvhak, a direct student of Vidal Sassoon. Most people don't realize that not only was Vidal Sassoon Jewish, but a very dedicated Jew. He was born in 1928, the product of a Sephardic Jewish father from Greece and an Ashkenazic mother in England. Father left the family when he was 3 years old, so he was really raised in abject poverty. Nonetheless, in 1948, he went to Palestine to fight for the Palmach. He spent a whole year in the Negev fighting the Egyptian army, purely voluntarily at the age of 20. Then he went into the hairdressing business at the urging of his mother. Good move. He made his fortune and he established a center for the study of anti-Semitism, which is active to this day in Hebrew University. And in today's climate, you can rest assured it's a very busy place. This was Vidal Sassoon, and John was aware of that also. So that's where John's remark came from. And again, if it wasn't for the remark about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus, it probably would have attracted a lot more attention. David Davis was a Baptist minister for 17 years. And he did something that we do. He asked questions. And after 17 years, he arrived at the conclusion that Judaism was right and Christianity was wrong. He did several things. Eventually, he wrote a book. But what he immediately did was convert his congregation to Noahide, and had an astonishing, amazing 50% retention rate. I don't know how he did it. And he offered to debate anyone, anywhere, anytime on the legitimacy of Judaism versus Christianity. Nobody ever took him on. Satellite congregations opened up in Seattle and elsewhere. He was featured on CNN. He was guided by an Orthodox rabbi named Michael Katz, and he had a direct line to the chief rabbi in Israel through New York. This was David Davis in 1986. 1 year later, in 1987, in Englewood, Susan Rosenberg launched The Jewish Voice, a monthly periodical, very pro-Zionist and pro-Orthodox. 3 years later, David Davis got rid of the bell that was in his church. Well, now it wasn't a church anymore, but he got rid of it because he said it was a pagan symbol. So he generated more attention. Around that time, Susan Rosenberg, through The Voice, asked him to come to Englewood to speak. And he did. He came on a very cold Sunday night and spoke in the Barney Horowitz Beis HaMedrash. That was in the previous facility. Our current facility came online in the summer of 2009. We were in a tent for 3 years, but from 1960 through Yom Kippur 2006, we were in the previous facility. And the Barney Horowitz Beis HaMedrash was where the Hashkama Minyan would meet. It was a very large room, and that night it was packed. David Davis spoke for an hour and a half, 45 minutes of prepared remarks, and 45 minutes answering questions. I want to deal with two of the questions and the answers. The first one was as follows. Someone asked him that when someone joins your congregation, Noahide congregation, do they have to give up the trappings, like Santa Claus and things like that? And he said yes. And then with a perfectly straight face, deadly seriously, he said, some people have an easier time giving up Jesus than giving up the Easter Bunny. I bring that up because we have all these minhagim that we do with the kids. We dress them up for Purim and the characters from the Megillah. We teach them how to gamble with the dreidel on Hanukkah. On Pesach, they search for the Afikomen and they ask the Firkashis and Manishtana. We cannot overestimate how powerful are these educational tools. And by the way, it was interesting. He was introduced at that evening by a fellow named Rabbi Aaron Unger, who on the side wrote for The Voice. And when he introduced him, he said that Noahidism is the oldest religion, because of course it predates Judaism, but it's also the newest, because David Davis had reinvigorated it from scratch. So that was an interesting point. The second question, which pertains to our topic, was as followed. David Davis was asked, if your son wanted to marry a Jewish girl, what would be your reaction? And he said, fine, as long as he does it on her terms. Those are his exact words, meaning that his son would have to convert. Now, I bring that up because suppose any one of us is non-Jewish, I think about myself, and then we decide that Judaism is right. We have two options. We can be Noahide or we can convert to Judaism. And it says in Sanhedrin, Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf and Vav, that a person who's Noahide has his share in the world to come. But the truth is that a Noahide doesn't experience that much of a dramatic change in his life. He can eat in the same restaurants. He's not obsessed with time. I mean, it's a change. It's important. I'm not minimizing it, but converting to Judaism is what I call a quantum leap. I mean, here am I cannot think about eating unkosher food, missing a day of tefillin, missing Shabbos. I even can't think of getting along without 2 days of Yom Tov. I mean, and there was a little story, Rabbi Golden, our immediate past, our Rabbi Emeritus. He said that when he was first hired in 1984, the board said to him, Rabbi, you really got to get rid of that Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golios, that second day of Yom Tov. And he looked at them as, what? Just a prank, although some of them meant it. But I can't get along without it. And yet I think to myself, what if I was non-Jewish and I decided Judaism was right? What would I do? Would I become a Noahide or would I convert to Judaism? Judaism is a really difficult religion. I spoke about this in August 2016 by Minchel Amarav. I was comparing us to reform, and I called what we have soul saturation. What we eat, when we can eat it. What we wear, shatnez, when we can wear it. Our obsession with time. I did not appreciate how much attention we paid to time until my mother was niftar and I was an onain, and for the first time I didn't have to worry about brachos. davening, and being on time for anything except the funeral. I mean, we are really transfixed with time. It's a very difficult religion. We say, in order to support the recitation of Kaddish D'Rabbanan, we say that sentence that comes at the end of each parak of Pirkei Avos, Rabbi Chananya ben Akasha Amar, Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'zakol Yisrael lefichach hirba alehem Torah u'mitzvos. He gave us a lot to do. And so the question is, would we convert, or would we just go Noachide? And every time I find out about someone else in a congregation who's a convert, and it comes up a conversation, someone will say, when I converted, and oh, look at that. I'm really amazed at such people because they've taken on so much. What does it have to do with our topic? It brings us back to the Nazir. Rabbi Golden said that we strive for perfection, but we never reach it. But the Nazir is taking on mitzvahs that he doesn't have to. It's as if he's saying, been there, done that, I need more. This is not enough. And as Rabbi Swift explained it 50 years ago, and that's how I recall it, he said, this is the opposite of anivos. If anivos, humility, is the most desirable trait, then gaiva, arrogance, is the most undesirable trait. And by saying, I need more mitzvos, that the mitzvos we already have are not enough to keep me occupied, he's displaying a form of arrogance. And so he's penalized by having to bring a korban chatas. Now, kosal kadatach, you might think, well, bringing a korban isn't that bad. Well, think about it. Next time you buy kosher meat for a couple of pounds, see how much it costs. Now extrapolate that to a full-grown sheep, which is a couple hundred pounds. That's a serious chunk of change. So bringing an extra korban really is a penalty. The Nazir is penalized for being extreme in his desire to be righteous, sort of violating what Shlomo HaMelech says in Koheles. So now let's review. We have Shimon and Levi. We have Moshe Rabbeinu, Shlomo HaMelech, Eliyahu, Yoshiyahu, the extreme Kohen who kills the other Kohen, the Zealots in Jerusalem, Rabbi Simcha Bunim, and we have the Nazir. All of these cases make it perfectly clear that extremism leads to negative consequences, some of them self-destructive. That's the lesson that we take with us today. Thank you for your time.